It was night, with only the lamps to give off intermittent light. He wandered the streets as he did every night, hoping to stumble across some food dropped or thrown away by people during the day. He had to be careful, in case he ran into some of the worse elements of the city that would kill him rather than look at him. Admittedly, this didn't happen very often. He was streetwise, and had been for most of his life. But the streets were unpredictable, so you had to be aware. Abandoned by his mother at an early age, he was almost put in a home, but managed to run away and had been here ever since. To him, the city was the whole world. He'd heard talk about what was on the outside, but never gave it much thought. It was hard enough trying to survive somewhere he knew, let alone somewhere he'd never seen. He'd made many friends since his escape. Most were runaways too. Some had been caught and taken back home, or hadn't had the skills to survive and fallen foul of the city's more undesirable residents. Some had even joined various gangs and spent their time terrorizing people. He had no intention of following them. He was smarter than that. He could sit in a shop doorway and not be noticed. All he needed to survive was himself. He could get a meal from the nearest bin, or, if he were in the right place at the right time, a generous restaurant owner would give him the end-of-day scraps. It wasn't the best way to live, but it kept him alive, and that was all that mattered. It's amazing what you'll eat when you're hungry. He caught a smell on the air. Sausages. The hot dog vendor had to be close by, and he could normally be suckered into donating. He rounded the corner, and just in front of him was the man dishing out hot dogs to his customers. He waited for the crowd to clear before approaching. The vendor looked at him. "You again, eh? OK, but just one. I'm not made of money," and handed his latest customer a steaming hot dog. It was hot, and he was forced to drop it. Still, it wasn't the first time he'd eaten off the floor, and it wouldn't be his last. He waited for it to cool a little before picking it up and walking off, taking a bite as he did so. The taste was heavenly. Good old Louis. He could always be relied on to supply a tasty treat. He slowly made his way down the street, totally immersed in his thoughts of sausage. So distracted, in fact, that he turned into Colley Avenue. A foul stench invaded his nostrils, and he immediately realized his mistake. Colley Avenue was gang territory, and the gang that patrolled it were particularly nasty. He was glad he'd finished his sausage, although that probably wouldn't stop them from trying to get at it. The avenue was quiet. Anywhere else that would be a good thing, but here it meant trouble. He looked behind to see if he hadn't wandered too far into hostile territory. He had, and too far was normally as far as you got in this neighbourhood. He knew the first attack would come from behind in order to cut off any retreat and force you further into their domain. Sure enough, there was a sound behind him, and against his better judgment, instinct forced him to run forwards. He was fast, but was he fast enough? He glanced down a side alley as he passed it and saw more gang members racing towards him. On he ran. His legs ached and his heart felt fit to burst, but he knew that was nothing compared to what would happen to him if he were caught. The end of the avenue was in sight. He knew they wouldn't follow him further than that, as another gang patrolled that particular street. He knew some of the members and thought he'd be safer there than here. Just ahead of him, right on the corner of Colley Avenue and Bracknell Road, out of nowhere, appeared 5 more gang members. He knew hesitation would cost him dearly, so on he ran, hoping to burst through the living roadblock. Just before he'd reached them, he lowered his head to form a battering ram and drew on his strength reserves. The gang screamed as he piled through them. One did manage to cut his face, and as the blood ran into his eye, he turned, panting, and realised that they weren't following. He'd made it. He barely walked 100 yards up the road before he was suddenly surrounded by dark figures. He knew it was futile to attempt to fight them. There were too many, and besides, he'd worn himself out already. He stood there and closed his eyes, expecting the inevitable. When it didn't happen, he opened them and saw, much to his relief, an old friend who'd gone to join a gang many years ago. His former friend didn't say a word. He just waved him through with a look that said, "This is for old time's sake. There won't be another chance." He nodded and walked through. After what seemed an age, he finally reached a street he recognised, Marshall Way, a street full of houses and trees, but most importantly, no gangs. He wandered up the street, his fatigue starting to get the better of him, until finally he collapsed on a lawn to get his breath. In his bleary state, he could make out the figure of a small boy approaching him. He tried to move, but his muscles just wouldn't cooperate. The boy knelt down next to him and examined the cut above his eye. "Poor thing," he said. "You're hurt." "Dad!" A man ran out of the house and came over to them. "Get back, son. You don't know where he's been," he said. "But, Dad, he's hurt." The man inspected the eye. "OK, let's get him in the house," he said. and picked up the weary traveller. He was carried into the house, laid out on the sofa, and covered with a blanket. "Do we need to call someone?" inquired the boy. "OK. Keep an eye on him. I'll call the vet." "There, there, boy," said the child, stroking his fur. "You're safe now."